and it takes me to Hong Kong for a whole month, which is the longest I've been here since 1990. So I taught at Hong Kong U for 8 years, 1982 to 1990. I've been back many times since, but never for a whole month, so that's a very nice thing for me. Okay, I thought I would just kick off actually by explaining how these lectures fit together. So, this is the schedule. Okay, now, Socialities of Music today, Anatomy of the Encounter, Debussy and the Gamelan, that's next week. Then a paper called Metal Something. That's a pretty cryptic title. Don't worry, I haven't written the paper. I have written a very long chapter that I have to create the paper out of, so there will be a paper. But I don't quite know what it will say, and I might or might not be called Nettles. What was it? Metal Something. There is a reason for that. It's not just totally arbitrary. And then the other classics, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven. That's actually intended as the final chapter of the book. Socialities of Music is intended as the first chapter of the book. The other two are chapters within the book. So all those four belong together, okay, in this book that I'm now writing. Actually, that book is not Music as Creative Practice. Music as Creative Practice is a separate book that was published last week in the US and in the UK sometime next month. And the actual Hing U lecture that I'm doing here on the 23rd of March sort of pulls out a thread from that book, okay? Whereas the final one, I've called it Piecing Together, Music, Encounter and the Relational, that's the book I'm still writing. It's a book I'm halfway through. It's a book which may or may not be called that because the title changes every week or two. And so on the 27th of March, I try and persuade my audience that these completely unrelated chapters do actually relate after all. Okay, so that's a more kind of informal presentation of trying to fit it together. Okay, so that's what I'm doing, and today then is a version, a abridged version of the first chapter of the new book, the book that doesn't quite exist yet. One of the more unexpected media phenomena of 2007 was the prime-time BBC TV series, The Choir, in which conductor, and by the time the series ended, TV celebrity Gareth Malone formed choirs in unlikely situations. An underachieving school, a rundown outer London neighbourhood, a failing business, a group of lonely service personnel's wives. In each case, the choir was formed of people who never sung before, and in some cases really had no wish to sing, but they found themselves drawn into the close network of mutual support that surrounds and endues choral singing. Each episode of the series began with the apparently impossible task of setting up a choir under the most unpromising circumstances, and progressed through uphill struggle to startling successful performance at some high-profile venue. Malone demonstrated how through singing and through the sense of community that develops through singing, people's life circumstances could be transformed in a way that they could never have anticipated it. So this is what some members of the South Doxy Community Choir had to say about it.
I mean, it's something what we never dreamed would happen in South Doxy. For a choir, no, I mean, South Doxy, all you heard was the bad about South Doxy. Now they can say the good about South Doxy, can't they?
Thank you very much for putting us on the map of arts. Yeah, of arts, right.
I feel really part of it, I feel part of the community, and everybody's totally come together. So I feel it's just amazing. It's never experienced this here before,
A good laugh, good times, meeting people that I never usually associate with that live on my estate.
Oh my god, it was amazing. I'll tell you what, that's got to be the best experience of my life ever. I'm never going to forget that.
You made me so happy. This really has been 9 months, really, the biggest 9 months of my life.
I felt a massive void in my life, and meeting new people, everything that's happened about today, the build up to today has been so wonderful.
I can't believe it. So emotional. Now, in the chapter that I'm taking this paper from, I talk about a number of specific choirs: a homeless men's choir in Montreal, a rural Icelandic choir, a choir of elderly Russian Jewish emigres in Jerusalem, and I do so in order to identify their social and relational effects. They create a sense of belonging, a sense of individual identity and self-worth. They create spaces for personal transformation. But the feeling of belonging, bonding, or unity is the most fundamental product of collective singing. And that's what I'm focusing on today. In the chapter, I cite some examples of this from Alf Gabrielson's strong experiences with music. In particular, there are repeated references in this book to fellowship. A Scandinavian man speaks of an extremely strong feeling of fellowship in the choir. An American woman speaks of an incredibly strong feeling of fellowship with all the other participants. Other young women speak of a feeling of euphoria and fellowship and of wanting to embrace the entire world. Members of the Icelandic choir I mentioned repeatedly expressed this sense of social cohesion by speaking of singing in harmony, using a word that applies to the musical and the social in equal measure. And there is an international community that has built not only a social and musical, but even an institutional structure on this idea of singing in harmony. And this is Barbershop, a choral movement that originated in North America, but has spread throughout several European countries, as well as South Africa and Australasia. As Liz Garnett has explained, actually she's an ex-PhD student of mine, as she's explained, the Barbershop community is organized around a number of national associations with unpronounceable acronyms, and a code of ethics from one of them includes a statement: "We shall endeavor to spread the love of Barbershop and its spirit of harmony through the world." Then again, the life president of another association tells its members, "Let us stay in close harmony together." Local societies often sign off their letters in harmony. While a member calling herself Jenny Barbershopper muses about how Barbershop mimics life. All the parts are woven into a whole, thus becoming a harmony. But Garnett's primary focus is on the specific consequences of what she calls this metaphorical conflation of musical parameter with social ideal. On the one hand, because competitions are a major element within the barbershop community, the associations spell out criteria for barbershop singing in a high degree of detail, and Garnett shows how the social values attached to harmony infiltrate them. For example, whereas common practice music theory regards seventh chords as dissonances, that would run counter to the spirit of harmony at the in the code of ethics that I referred to, and so the same association's barbershop arranging manual explicitly reclassifies sevenths as a kind of consonance. On the other hand, a particular high spot of barbershop performance is what's called expanded sound or ringing chords, which, in the words of one judging handbook, create the impression that the composite ensemble sound constitutes more than the total sound of the individual voices together. And in this way, it expresses agreement in purpose, message, theme, and style. And just in case you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll play a short clip to illustrate it. Really telling thing about that clip is the audience reaction. The same handbook lays down that the techniques for creating expanded sound should be, quote, natural, unmanufactured, and free from apparent effect. Which, as Garnett says, is ironic. Expanded sound is a product of precise intonation, vowel sound, and balance. It requires considerable skill and extensive rehearsal to accomplish. So in this context, as in many others, calling something natural can be read as a hegemonic strategy that identifies one way of doing things with the way the world is. Now, what's unusually explicit in Barbershop is the way that a social ideal has become reflexive, not simply emerging out of musical practice, but being deliberately applied back into it. This makes it particularly clear that the idea of musical and social harmony, you see the subtitle here, that musical and social harmony is intended not just as a metaphor, collective music making is a symbol of strongly bonded egalitarian community, but also as a metonym. Choral performance structured according to the spirit of harmony creates a better world, at least as long as the music lasts. And that is the idea which, to a greater or lesser degree, animates the broader community choir movement, which during recent decades has burgeoned to the extent that today there are supposedly more choirs in Britain than fish and chip shops. I wouldn't rely on that fact, but that's what they're saying. Now, one obvious point of resonance between Barbershop and the community choir movement is the idea of the natural. At the heart of the development of community choirs is the natural voice movement, where the word natural immediately suggests an opposition to the classical music establishment and its training of the voice to match preconceived ideas of the musical. In our authoritative study of the natural voice movement, Caroline Bithell has explained that the use of the term is more complex and conflicted than that might suggest, but there's a clear resonance with the movement's inclusive values. The classical tradition is seen in contrast as tied to the idea that musical ability is the exception rather than the norm, the preserve of an elite, and in this way part of a broader cult of celebrity. In short, the trained voice is seen as embodying the politics of exclusion and robbing people of their birthright. Bithell cites an oft-repeated African saying from the Natural Voice Practitioners Network: if you can walk, you can dance. If you can talk, you can sing. Natural also has a further connotation. The natural voice movement is also built on a fundamental commitment to orality. And there are several dimensions to this. From the inclusive perspective of an open access choir, musical literacy is a mechanism of gatekeeping that enables music to be specified by those in positions of power and more or less slavishly followed by the performer. In this way, as Bithell says, the bypassing of musical literacy represents a challenge to fundamental assumptions, conventions, and power relations that underpin many areas of musical creativity in Britain. She compares the idea of the natural voice to the natural childbirth movement. The point being that, in a quite different strategy for invoking nature, both movements are motivated and defined through opposition to official hegemonies. In the one case, it's the classical music establishment. In the other case, it's a hospital system seen as medicalizing birth and reifying women's bodies. And the parallel is foregrounded when a community choir director says, it's not about those notes, it's about finding that center of understanding of what it means to be human. And in this way, the highly dispersed world of community choirs takes on some of the qualities of a bottom-up political movement, based on shared values of democratization, empowerment, community building, health and well-being, and cultural identity. It resembles a subculture, or even a counterculture. Yet it's based as much on the politics of utopia as the politics of the real world. In an article on the Montreal Homeless Choir that I talk about in my chapter, Becky Bailey and Jane Davidson speak of their public performances creating a safe distance from the real world represented by the audience. Collective music making creates a liminal zone, a space for potential transformation, with the warm-up session with which choir meetings begin, serving as a rite of passage. To say that establishes a link with the concept of communitas that the anthropologist Victor Turner drew from his studies of ritual, meaning by it a particularly intense form of community in which, as with the strong experiences of choral singing recounted by Gabrielson, individuals feel themselves bonded within a larger group. In this way, as Little says, individuals are brought into autonomous, creative, and harmonious interaction with one another and with their environment. And this constitutes a source of collective joy, conviviality, and self-determination. Communal music making is transformed from a metaphor of social cohesion in the enacting of a better world, is transformed from a metaphor of social cohesion to the enacting of a better world, but a world grasped only fleetingly, less a reality than a possibility. And that, in a nutshell, is the definition of utopia as conceived by the German Marxist philosopher Ernst Bloch, not so much as a future reality, as a potential for emancipation that exists within the present. In Gilles Dolan's words, it's a utopia always in process, always only potentially grasped as it disappears before us around the corners of narrative and social experience. But if Bloch is a key utopian thinker in fields that range from performance studies to political philosophy, there are also other sources of utopian thinking about music and community. And another influential early example is the philosopher and phenomenological sociologist Alfred Schutz. To borrow the title of his famous essay of 1951, Schutz's vision of making music together was based on the idea of physical co-presence and shared temporality among its participants, audience included. Whether in the concert hall or around a campfire, this creates a space for heightened intersubjectivity, which is Wittfeld's definition of communitas, or as Schutz more memorably expressed it, a mutual tuning in relationship, the experience of the we, which is the foundation of all possible communication. And a few pages later, he speaks of performers and listeners being tuned into one another, living together through the same flux, growing older together while the musical process lasts. The resonance with the language of the hippie communities that developed by the end of the following decade is probably accidental, but it's also not inappropriate. Now, in the original chapter, I now talk about associations of utopian thinking with jazz. In the interest of time, I'm going to cram this into just 2 points. So, first, there's the straightforwardly political interpretation, as when Charles Hirsch describes Ornette Coleman's collectively improvised piece, Free Jazz, as combining unprecedented individual freedom with group coherence, and so representing a musical enactment of the ideas of freedom put forward in the growing civil rights movement. Second, there are the versions that revolve explicitly around race, which I trace back to the black poet, folklorist, and Harvard professor Sterling Brown. He spoke of the democracy in action of jam sessions, both public and private, where Negro and white musicians meet as equals to improvise collectively and create the kind of music that they love. Here, the performance color does not matter, he says. The quality of the music he makes is the basis for camaraderie and respect. Seen this way, I argue jazz is both a metaphor and a metonym of a better world, just as it is for the barbershop community and the theorists of communitas. I also trace a more specific link between jazz and barbershop discourses, which revolves around orality, or in the musician and writer Ben Sidran's terms, between oral and literate man. Terms which Sidran treats as effectively interchangeable with black and white. He speaks, for example, of the peculiarly black approach to rhythm as a function of the greater oral approach to time, which is itself the product of the inherently communal nature of oral improvisation. And I talk about one of my favorite bête noire, the Australian jazz commentator Bruce Johnson, who drives in the wedge between oral and literate music to the extent that, in his view, jazz has in significant respects more in common with and is therefore better understood in relation to non-musical improvisational practices than with non-improvisational musical practices. And of course, classical music has its own tradition of utopian thinking. Historically, it's the string quartet, and in particular the string quartet in the German-speaking countries, around which utopian metaphors of music as society have clustered most densely. This starts with the inclusivity and social bonding that play so large a role in the worlds of choral singing and community music. According to the early 19th century writer on music, Johann Patiscus, the magic of music makes everyone equal and binds together in friendship those whom rank and conditions would otherwise have kept eternally apart. Again, I've written about this before, as have Mary Hunter and Edward Clawin, among others, so just briefly, I talk about the familiar metaphor of string quartets as conversation, and about how the quartet becomes an arena for staged negotiations of social relations. As Clawin puts it, instruments take on such persona as leader, follower, inventor of new musical ideas, bringer of direction, purveyor of grace, and so forth. And in this way, they assert an autonomy from or even antagonize one another. Now, such ideas extend to a form of social equality when an anonymous writer, possibly the composer Giuseppe Cambini, says in 1804 that players must limit their egos for the sake of the whole. And similarly, Patiscus writes that each player should moderate his tone so as not to scream out above the others. It's like Daniel Barenboim's rationale for the West-East Taiwan Orchestra as an instrument of conflict transformation. In an orchestra, he says, none should attempt to play louder than the next. They must respect and know each other. And elsewhere, Patiscus speaks of a four-in-oneness in which the unity of the whole and the independence of the four voices set limits on each other. And when he says that, he's coming close to Adorno's socio-political interpretation of middle period Beethoven. Finally, after noting some of the usual discrepancies between the utopian vision and the reality, I point out how these idealizing discourses are grounded in both institutional and material culture. To borrow a phrase from Edward Said, this practical utopia came into being around the numerous quartet clubs that sprang up in German cities, of which the philosopher and writer of music Christian Friedrich Michaelis said in 1829 that their primary activity was the study of Beethoven's quartets. The latest and most difficult masterworks had gone through 50 or 100 or more times in order to fully enter into the spirit of the master, Beethoven, and to play him worthily. No effort is spared, the score is consulted in relation to the intention of the master, the meaning of individual sponsor, the wholes, all earnestly discussed, every good suggestion put to practical test, and the satisfied listener is surprised by the explanations of the listeners that still are not satisfied with themselves. As for material culture, it's worth noticing that this form of utopia depended on one of those little but important facts that tend to be forgotten in music history. Beethoven was the first composer to simultaneously publish his quartets in score and in parts. It's also worth pointing out that the particular intimacy of string quartet performance was also afforded by another material agent. The quartet table, which was being manufactured at just this time and came in both circular and rectangular designs, with the common feature of both being that the players face one another, they look at one another. Now, the fundamental mechanism behind all utopian effects of communality is mutual listening. And I'll begin with a negative example that I've again written about before. It's said that before the first performance of Ernst Krenek's Second Symphony, the composer told the players, now we're going to play a piece which you'll not understand one bit. Whoever thinks is the theme, please play very loud. As we're told, the players dutifully did so, and their ranging performance had a colossal effect that produced an immediate uproar in the audience, and actually terrified T.W. Adorno, who was 18 at the time and in the audience. The dystopic music effect was created through the construction of a situation in which the players did not listen to or negotiate with one another. They just played. As a negative example, this reveals the extent to which the normative fabric of music is a dense web of mutual listening. In the first half of the sentence, in which he says orchestral musicians must respect and know each other, Daniel Barenboim writes that an orchestra requires musicians to listen to one another. Gustavo Dudamel, as it were the Barenboim of the Simon Bolivar Youth Orchestra, expresses the same thought in more explicitly utopian words when he says that an orchestra is a little community, but the perfect community because you need to listen to the other musicians. And Ingrid Monson's claim that in jazz to say that a player doesn't listen is a grave insult applies just as much to Western classical music as it does to jazz. And of course it's not just jazz and Western classical music of which this applies. Speaking of the Korean vocal genre pansori, Yen-Lok Chang writes that in traditional performance the drummer gives the singer his full attention. He not only adapts to the tempo and dynamics defined by the singer, he also assists her by offering calls of encouragement, chuimsai. Ideally, the drummer adds to the performance by helping the singer sustain her physical stamina and by enhancing the mood that she is attempting to create. While the dimensions of care that are evident here capture the relational quality of musical listening, the phenomenon of chuimsai underlines the extent of its mutuality. At least in traditional pansori performances, audience members too shout out encouragement. And this isn't a simple expression of feeling, it's a codified practice in which particular verbalizations are appropriate for particular situations. And it's one of a number of traditions of vocal or gestural participation that also include the connoisseurial culture of North Indian music and the Arab tradition of Tarab, of which Martin Stokes describes as a democratic art in which everyone listens to everyone else and everybody contributes equally in their own particular way. But perhaps the most striking account of music making us a web of interactive listening comes from Benjamin Brunner, who describes patterns of listening among gamelan members that are informed by deep knowledge of the conventions governing the highly formulaic genre of gamelan. Gamelan performance is based on a repertory of established pieces, but because of its formulaic quality, patterns of elaboration can be generated on the fly, in real time. And as Brunner explains, how you listen depends very much on what instruments you're playing and how it fits into the textures of the music. Rather in the manner of conductorless orchestra in the Western classical tradition, for example, the Britten Sinfonium, performances are structured through patterns of cues, points that necessitate and depend on closely defined acts of listening, often eye contact. Remember the quartets. The difference is that whereas with the Britten Sinfonia, patterns of cues are established through prolonged rehearsal of individual pieces, in the gamelan they're generic, they're specified by the instrument and the particular role that it plays within the ensemble. If you play the gong, your attention will be oriented to the large cycles within which gamelan performance falls, and to patterns of shifting tempo. You'll also have a kinetic engagement that is quite different from the player of one of the fast parts for key metalphones, especially if you're interlocking with another player, which demands split-second timing. Listening also changes dynamically in line with structure, such as at points where the drummer can cue the gamelan to stop in the middle of a cycle in order to give the female singer a break for a solo. When you approach such points, musicians are likely to turn their attention to the drumming in order to note whether a cue is given. At the same time, it's evident that musicians monitor other aspects of the music. Brunner mentions pulse, phrase markers, and melodic outline, because when something goes wrong, it becomes amply clear from the musician's reactions that they've been listening all along. As a conclusion, Brunner draws from all this underlies the intensely relational nature of musical listening. One of his aims, he says, is to demonstrate the interconnectedness of the individual mind and the social network in making music. There's little point in studying only the way an individual listens, he says, for his or her listening is inevitably shaped by such interactions with others. This is one of the fundamental points that Ingrid Monson makes about ostensibly solo improvisation in her book, Saying Something. And I'd argue that it's a point that applies to music quite generally. Even conducted orchestral music, which involves patterns of social interaction that are far more complex and dynamic than might at first sight appear. It has in which all personal differences of class, status, age, gender, and other personal distinctions are stripped in vivid presence. There's a resonance between this relational mutuality and the empathetic attunement that the music psychologist Frederick Seddon sees as the precondition for collaborative and intersubjective performance. In order to reach empathetic attunement, he says, musicians must decenter and see things from the other musicians' musical points of view, aiming at a collective transparency of sound where each part is discernible, and that in turn makes the link with discus, Barenboim, and Dudamel. The theme of listening, with its connotation of openness to the other, gives a broadly ethical connotation to a foundational musical skill, and translates easily across genres. Tropes of mutual concern run through Don Nunn's claim that free improvisers are important to society in bringing to light some fundamental values and ideas. For example, how to get along, how to be flexible, how to be creative, how to be supportive, how to be angry, how to make do. The idea of mutual intersubjective listening, listening in which you place yourself in the position of the other, in which you hear yourself through the other's ears, this lies at the heart of interactive real-time music making. Now, in order to further develop this point, I'm going to approach it tangentially. There's a saying, which I can't find anywhere, but it seems too good for me to have invented it, that indifferent architects think in terms of plans. Better architects think in terms of spaces, and the best architects think in terms of people. Learning is a social activity, writes Kim Cameron, and so when Frank Gehry designed the Peter B. Lewis building for the Weatherhead School of Management, Cleveland, Ohio, one of his key objectives was, quote, to foster lots of chance collisions and productive interaction patterns. In short, Gehry began with social action and interaction, and he designed spaces that would afford that. Transferred into sonic terms, that's exactly what the composer and theorist Stephen Miles, who runs a new music ensemble at New College, Florida, was doing when he wrote his Social Studies, a series of text compositions that choreograph social interaction involving both musicians and audiences. In affiliation, for example, everyone who wishes to participate sings whatever pitch they wish. As they pause to take breath, they listen for others who are singing the same pitch. If they find such participants, they affiliate with that person. If they don't, then they affiliate with someone singing a different pitch, and the two of them gradually alter their pitches until they converge. The piece continues until everyone is singing the same pitch. In this way, affiliation reverses the conventional sequence of composition. Normally, compositions are conceived in terms of songs, but have social consequences. In contrast, affiliation is conceived in terms of social relations, which have sonic consequences. And the same can be said of another of Stephen Miles's text compositions, the excruciatingly titled Hocket Science. Don't worry, I can't expect you to read all that. But this piece adds a further dimension because it links social process to an established musical technique. In brief, participants begin by singing a nursery rhyme which is progressively fragmented until only 3 or 4 note motifs remain. These are then sung in the form of a hocket, that's to say, a continuous musical line to which each participant contributes their 3 or 4 notes in succession. Pairs of participants then negotiate their 3 or 4 note fragments until they converge on a common version, rather as with the individual pitches in affiliation. Finally, these agreed fragments are reassembled into a new melody through a further process of negotiation that involves the entire group. Participants stand in a circle, singing their agreed fragments in sequence, and changing positions within the circle as they experiment with different sequences. When adjacent participants agree on the sequence of their fragments, they hold hands and each sings both fragments. The process continues until the entire group is holding hands and singing in unison. Instead, I discovered later this guy actually became the principal of New College, Florida. Do you think he was a good principal? Anyhow, as Miles explains, what drives this piece is the need to connect and the willingness to keep exploring new combinations until consensus has been reached. When the group succeeds and sings its new song in unison, they've discovered that music is more process than product, more concerned with listening and understanding than with the object heard. And the Hockett technique serves to intensify this social process. Every transition point from one participant to another depends on close listening if the musical process is to keep going. It's in this way both a means for the negotiation of social relationship and a means for making that negotiation audible. You could say the same of the catches that were sung in the men's clubs of late 17th century England, but really the point is a far more general one. It applies to any musical genre in which people work in close alignment with a high degree of mutual listening and codependence. And actually there are few of any genres of which you can't say that, even if it's not always apparent to listeners. Arnold Steinhardt, the leader of the Guarneri Quartet, so he's the third one along from the left, Steinhardt has written of his first attempt at quartet playing as a student at the Curtis Institute of Music. The Mozart quartet they'd been assigned looked easy in the score, he said. No daredevil runs at high speeds, no finger twisters, just lyrical, pleasing music. But when they started playing, the ensemble was chaotic and we all missed our cues. And then he refers to what might be seen as a more flexible application of the hocketing principle. Where Mozart divided up a phrase and allotted a section of it to each player, we were at a loss as to how to connect the sections. A relay race was taking place in which each runner flooded the passing of the baton. And if this was such easy music, why was I stumbling over notes, making a poor sound and having trouble with the simplest rhythms? The principle of hocketing then both focuses social relationship through close listening and discloses it as sound. Intimate collective coordination is realized in the sound of continuous melodic line that no individual is actually playing or singing, and that might in that sense be said to be collectively owned. As a paradigmatic technique of musical sociality, hocketing is distributed across many times, places and genres, and we can use it as a kind of Ariadne's thread through the phenomena of close mutual listening. It's a basic principle of Central African horn orchestras and of traditional Indonesian angklung ensembles, in which each instrument plays one pitch and every melody is a product of social collaboration. Precisely the same may be said of the originally English but now worldwide phenomenon of change ringing, which resulted from the invention of the full circle ringing technique in the early 17th century. I didn't know that till I read this paper. Equally ubiquitous are the more flexible applications of the hocketing principle that involve multiple notes, as in Hocket science or indeed in Mozart quartets. Examples range from the interlocking patterns of gamelan metallophones that Brynja spoke of, to successive historical practices within Western traditions, from French music of the 13th and 14th centuries to Louis Andriesen's 1977 composition Hocketus, or the interlocking guitar parts in the title track of King Crimson's Fracture from the 2000 album The Construction. So far then, I've explored utopian thinking in a range of what might be called iconic genres, genres specifically associated with social bonding and heightened communality. And I've argued that these effects have their sources in patterns of mutual listening that extend across music making much more generally. In the remainder of this paper, I want to advance a complementary argument about another widespread assumption associated with the entire enterprise of community music and its projects of inclusion and personal transformation. the assumption that the fundamental source of music's community-building powers, and hence its value as a social good, is participation. Bithell, for example, writes that it is participation rather than consumption which empowers and transforms individuals and helps to build communities. And in their article on the Montreal Homeless Choir, Bailey and Davidson take it for granted that participation lies at the core of music's social benefits. Life satisfaction is enhanced, they say, through experiences that provide active involvement and mental absorption, whereas passive activities result in mental entropy and dissatisfaction with the quality of life. We may feel happy watching television, going to the movies, or during a myriad of other entertaining activities, listening to a Beethoven symphony. But on reflection, these passive activities often leave an unsettling sense of life wasted. Now, Bailey and Davidson are drawing a clear line between productive and creative endeavors, such as singing in a choir on the one hand, and on the other hand, the passive and presumably uncreative entertainment provided by reproduction technology. Such thinking draws on several traditions of more or less reactionary critique. Of libels against recorded music, you can trace that back through Hans Keller and Roland Barthes to Adorno, and of art as against entertainment, you can trace that back from Stuart Hampshire and R.G. Collingwood to Hanslick. And it links these to ideas of community participation that are drawn from the social, health and political sciences, as for example, in the connection that Alexis de Tocqueville drew between social participation and the healthy operation of democracy. Within such a genealogy, the idea of participation itself becomes seen as a social good, its positive qualities being taken to be self-evident. But just as I resisted drawing a clear line between oral and literate music, so I want to argue that the social effects of music are far less restricted than such arguments about participation might suggest. And therefore I want to argue that these effects are much more widespread within the conditions of a modern world in which music is predominantly consumed in the form of public presentation, and in particular sound or audiovisual recordings. Within music, the values of participation have been most influentially argued by two writers on music and community whose thinking is strongly conditioned by utopian thought. They are Christopher Small and Thomas Torino, and I'll discuss each in turn. So, a classically trained musician who had become disillusioned with that tradition's elitism and lack of social inclusion, the New Zealand-born composer and teacher Christopher Small, who died in 2011, introduced the term musicking in 1987. Through its verbal form, musicking, he meant to imply that music is not a thing at all, but an activity, something that people do. And in this way, he displaced the traditional focus on musical products, symphonies, concept albums, and the rest, by a focus on the collaborative process of making music in real time. For him, music's value resided in that process, in the creation and performance of relationships. As he said, it's the relationships that it brings into existence in which the meaning of musical performance lies. And the utopian dimension of Small's thought came into play when he spoke, as he repeatedly did, of bringing into existence an ideal society, a set of ideal social relationships. Now, the sociologist and media theorist David Hesmonthals, who quotes this, writes that Small's perspective is typical of a certain way of thinking that locates the value of music in its potential to recover a primitive sociality that has been lost. And that's then made on the basis of a quest for, and that is then made the basis of a quest for an ideal future. That places Small in a lineage that encompasses Ferdinand Tönnies, who introduced the opposition of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, and those in Tönnies' wake, who saw and continue to see industrialization and urbanization as breaking down the traditional bonds that hold society together. And Hesmonthals' reference to primitive sociality articulates the curiously never-never land quality of Small's image of musical community. It's an image that somehow combines the qualities of an idealized Africa, Africa that's more imaginary than real, with a rather out-of-focus medievalism. I always found myself associating it with the same image from Peter Bruegel, the Elders, the fight between Carnival and Lent, the same images that were used for both the French and English versions of Jacques Attalier's Noise. It's in this holding out of a never quite real past as a model for a utopian future that Small's thinking most obviously resonates with Bloch's, though a British source might be found in William Morris's version of collaborative musical performance as a metaphor for medieval art making. And that's a vision that drove Morris's own idiosyncratic combination of utopian communitarianism and the purveying of luxury decorative goods. You don't get what I'm on about here because it's something that is probably more understandable in Britain. I can enlarge it for you. And in this context, it's worth remembering Morris's close links with the initial stages of the early musical revival, another utopian nexus of music and community. In recent years, that's to say posthumously, Small has become one of the most widely cited authors in music studies, even if the citation rarely goes much further than the term musicking. While acknowledging his significance, Hesmond House complains of the disjuncture between Small's utopia and the realities of everyday life. Small blurs performance and participation, he says, and he asks, to what extent does the modern divide between performers and audiences, producers and consumers, affect their supposedly shared quest for an ideal society? And the question arises because while emphasizing the value of musicking as something active rather than passive, Small is careful to define it extremely broadly. Musicking, he says, is a form of human encounter in which everyone who is present is taking part, and for whose success or failure is an event, everybody who is present has some responsibility. It's not just a matter of active performers doing something for or to passive listeners. Whatever it is that's being done, we're all doing it together. Now, in contrast, in his widely read book from 2008, Music and Social Life, the ethnomusicologist Thomas Torino defines participation in a much narrower way than Small's musicking. I'm using the idea of participation in the restricted sense of actively contributing to the sound and motion of a musical event through singing, dancing, clapping, and playing musical instruments, when each of these activities is considered integral to the performance. For Torino, then, there's a fundamental distinction between the fields of participatory music, so defined, and what he calls presentational music, where musicians play for a non-participant audience, as in the Western classical concert. There's a tendency to see participatory music making as a lesser version of the real music made by the pros, Torino says, but he says that's wrong. Participatory music is something else, a different form of art and activity entirely. And more, participatory music has more in common with a neighborhood baseball game than it does with presentational music. You might have noticed there's a striking resonance between that and Bruce Johnson's claim, which I quoted earlier, that improvised music has more in common with non-musical improvisational practices than with non-improvisational musical practices. And it's not entirely accidental, because the sharp distinction that Torino is making between participatory and presentational music is closely related to the one that Johnson was making between oral and literate music. Torino warns against interpreting the distinction between participatory and presentational music in terms of genre and style characteristics, but his characterization of the musical qualities that afford participation unmistakably focus on the same semi-improvisatory fluidity and the use of formulae that Brinner noted in gamelan music, together with the open and repetitive forms that are characteristic of jazz. In the same way, Torino repeatedly claims that participatory and presentational music should be equally valued, but his personal allegiance shines out when he writes that in performance, I feel a deep sense of oneness with the people I'm playing with. And Torino's participatory music inherits many of the values that I've already described. What is the inclusiveness that's so prized in community music? Torino enumerates the stylistic characteristics that favor the participation of performers at widely differing skill levels. Another is the setting of communal practices in opposition to the official hegemonies of what Torino repeatedly refers to as the capitalist cosmopolitan formation. And then there are the social and relational qualities that Small emphasizes. Participatory music and dance is more about the social relations being realized through the performance than about producing art that can somehow be abstracted from those social relations. He acknowledges that, like any social activity, say a professional football match, presentational music brings people together and can thus connect individuals and identity groups. But, he continues, participatory music making connects people more intimately and more powerfully because of the shared interactive engagement among the participants and the actual doing of the activities with each other. And in this way, by drawing a clear line between participatory and presentational music, Torino suggests an answer to Hesmondhalger's question about the modern divide between performers and audiences. It's in participatory music that the ideal society is brought into being, however fleetingly, while presentational music is, in essence, a modernized and mediated simulacrum of the real thing, ultimately an empty sign. Criticizing the utopianism of Small's and Torino's models of participation, Hesmondhalger writes that the challenge is how to conceive music's social effects in a way that doesn't rely on an impossible notion of community as the only realization of music's potential for sociality. And so, in his book, he advocates for music as a social practice whose aims are more modest but also more deliverable. We need to look for beneficial experiences of sociability in life as it is currently lived, he says, and not inspire to impossible levels of communality. I agree, and I think that further interrogation of the idea of participation may help in the realization of this aim. In essence, my aim is to soften or even dissolve the sharp boundaries that Torino erects around participation. For one thing, drawing a clear line between participation and presentation obscures the extent of blurring that may be found between these categories, and so gives rise to a reductive concept of musical culture in the same way as does drawing too clear a line between oral and literate cultures. Torino's presentational culture is built around the conception of a musical piece as a set item, an art object, whereas in participatory music, a piece is more like a set of resources. Well, this way of thinking is unmistakably modern. It would be quite anachronistic to apply it to notated traditions of Western music before the metaphor of music as art object congealed into a regulative principle around the end of the 18th century. For example, late 17th century musical practices in England, as described by Rebecca Harrison, were highly collaborative, lacking any clear separation between such roles as composer, arranger, and performer, and involving a very fluid concept of the musical piece. There were also notation-based cultures, such as that of consort music, that were far more participatory than they were presentational. And the point can be equally well made in terms of the 19th century culture of string quartets that I already talked about. It's not just that through a presentational culture it was understood and experienced in terms of the value of participation. It's that in significant ways the string quartet was a participatory culture. Even if they didn't actually play, the enthusiasts who participated in Michaelis's quartet clubs couldn't be described as engaged in passive or uncreative entertainment. In Small's terms, they were clearly musicers. Then again, Torino explains that in participatory music, performance preparation tends to be as open as the music itself, or there may simply be no preparation, whereas presentational music necessitates what he calls goal-directed and detail-oriented rehearsal. Yet as late as 1825, Karl Holz, the second violinist of the Chopin C Quartet, which gave the first performance of many of Beethoven's quartets, Holz wrote into the Deaf Composer's Conversation book that we only rehearse your quartets, not those of Haydn and Mozart, which work better without rehearsal. As Clauman says, intensive rehearsal in the modern sense was essentially unknown before the rise of public chamber music series. In other words, until the advent of Beethoven's mature quartets, which were too hard to sight read, until the advent of Beethoven's quartets and the modern concert, string quartet culture was largely a culture of sight reading, and as Clauman says, this must have lent the playing an air of adventure as well as a spontaneous off-the-cuff quality. Of course, Torino's concept of presentational music is intended for the context of present day rather than historical practices, and the same quartets are today given in polished, carefully rehearsed performances that in purely sonic terms can sometimes be hard to distinguish from recordings. That doesn't mean that the improvisational character of early performances entirely disappeared, rather that it has become subordinated to the sometimes contradictory ideologies of supposedly historical performance and fidelity to the composer's intentions that emerge from the combination of absolute music aesthetics and recording technology. But that only brings me to my main claim. Although a largely participatory culture of the string quartet has been modernized into a largely presentational culture, I claim that the music is still heard in terms of dynamic socialities in much the same way as, for example, Stephen Miles' social studies pieces. The full title of Clauman's book is Music's Music of Friends, Social Interplay in the Chamber Works. And Clauman himself is a violinist and a member of the Tesseract Quartet, so that for him, as for the musicians and the painting, the conversational exchanges and social interactions of musical agents I described are embodied in real-time performance. But remember that the metaphor of music as conversation came from Goethe, and I know of no evidence that Goethe ever played in a quartet, although he did actually at one stage study the cello. My claim is that whether or not they have personal experience of quartet performance, people go on listening to Haydn's, Mozart's and Beethoven's quartets, even when they know them backwards, because the music is renewed every time in performance, just as conversation constantly renews itself. People hear the sociality of conversational exchanges in the music, the sociality of shifting relationships reminiscent of the formal dances from Mozart's day, and the sociality of the little dramas of deference and assertion that for Richard Sennett lie at the very core of chamber music. In short, I'm claiming that music's construction and negotiation of socialities is fundamental to the experience of listening and not just of participation in Torino's restricted sense. Okay, so that's what I'm claiming, but how might I support that claim? Well, I could adopt the traditional academic strategy of quoting someone else. After spelling out the origins of music's adaptive benefits in infant-carer relationships, Ellen Dysoniaki considers their applicability to modern modes of musical consumption. She says, modern listeners who respond to music primarily as abstract patterns of sound may, I suggest, gain some of those adaptive social benefits even if they listen passively and privately. Listeners know tactfully, if not overtly, that fellow humans are making the music that they hear and that a fellow human has composed it. In this sense, all human music is experienced socially, reinforcing the human bonds to be found in experiencing abstract patterns of sound that are meaningful and emotionally significant to other humans. Then again, my claim is entirely consistent with the evidence of the mirror neuron system. As is now well known, studies of the brains of macaque monkeys have revealed the existence of neurons that fire in the same way when the monkey does something, sees another monkey doing the same thing, or hears it. In Arnie Cox's words, In terms of neural response, there's no difference between doing, seeing, and hearing. And more than that, it's consistent with the empirical study by Ehud Bodner and Abigail Bauer, who played what they called crisis songs, a genre of songs broadcast at times of national crisis, to two highly antagonistic groups within contemporary Israeli society. On the one hand, religious Jews, on the other hand, secular Jews. And they found that within each group the effect was to reduce prejudice against the other. Now the point here is that the groups weren't singing the songs. They were simply exposed to 5 minutes recorded music, and yet the effect happened. But most directly significant is a study by Eric Clark, Tia Denora, and Jona Voskoski. Yeah, Voskoski. Jona Voskoski. I last did this paper at Cambridge, and that's where Jona Voskoski is, where she's working. So I practiced her name, but I've clearly forgotten it in between. Okay, now this was a major review of the literature around music, empathy, and cultural understanding, and it included a critical experiment. Much of the literature the authors reviewed was based on the same assumption made by Bethel, Bailey, and Davidson, Small, and Torino, that music's demonstrable effects on social cohesion and affiliation are limited to musical activities involving actual interpersonal participation. But, they continued, could passive music listening produce similar effects? That's what their experiment was designed to test. So, in brief, they measured 61 individuals' tendency towards empathy. They divided them randomly into 2 groups. They told each group to immerse themselves in the music they heard, with one group being played a popular music track from India and the other one from Africa. And then they tested the subject's positive or negative feelings about the culture in question. Empathetic individuals showed a significantly stronger preference for the culture whose music they had heard. Emphasizing that their experiment was based on experiencing music under arguably the most passive circumstances, solitary headphone listening in a laboratory setting, the researchers commented that this is a striking result, one that provides narrow but hard-nosed evidence for music's positive intercultural potential. But I'm a musicologist, and I'd also like to support my claim in a less hard-nosed and more musicological manner, one that problematizes the extent to which listening can really be said to be passive in the first place. As I've argued elsewhere, listening to music, even on record, is an intrinsically embodied experience. One aspect of this is, no doubt, a translation of sound into gesture on the basis of instrumental or vocal performance, whether on the basis of personal experience as a performer or watching live or televised music. But there's more to it than that. John Blacking coined the term bodily empathy, by which he explains that waves of feeling are generated in the body and between bodies, and discrete sequences and tempos and patterns of music can be discerned analogous to the ebb and flow of a piece of music. Blacking's primary emphasis here is on the embodied nature of the experience. He speaks of patterns of interactions and movement being shaped from within the body, or conversely one might say that when you listen you map the motions of music onto your own body. But his reference to waves being generated between bodies indexes the sociality of this experience. You listen not just as an embodied individual, but as a member of what might be called an intercorporeal community. That makes sense in the context of live performance. There are times, perhaps at rock festivals rather than in the concert hall, unless it's Lang Lang playing, when you can almost see Blacking's waves rippling through the audience. But what about recordings? Well, here I invoke Michel Chion's principle of what he calls transsensorial perception. When kinetic sensations organized into art are transmitted through a single sensory channel, through this single channel they can convey all the other senses at once. In other words, when people listen to recordings, all they literally perceive are sounds, but the dynamic shapes that are inherent in the sounds, Blacking's waves of feeling, spread throughout the body through a kind of contagion from one sensory modality to another. And that is how you listen with the body and to the body, even when you're hearing a sound recording. Now, the idea of intercorporeality already introduces a social and interactive dimension to ostensibly passive listening, and of course, listeners may also parse recorded sounds into individual instrumental and vocal parts, and in that way read the sound for its traces of sociality. When the comedian Eric Sykes appeared on the long-running British radio show Desert Island Discs in 1997, he explained his choice of Handel's Hallelujah Chorus on the grounds that the sound of a chorus of singers might serve as a substitute for a group of people, and he added that he might join it himself. But as in the case of gesture, there's more to the social dimension of listening than that, and I'll make the point in two ways. Actually, Jean-Jacques Rousseau has already made the first one for me. As soon as vocal signs strike your ear, he writes in his essay on the origin of languages, they announce to you of being like yourself. They are, so to speak, the voice of the soul. If you hear them in the wilderness, they tell you that you are not there alone. Birds whistle, man alone sings, and one cannot hear either singing or a symphony without immediately acknowledging the presence of another intelligent being. That, of course, is in line with Dysaniaki's claim, and all I want to add is that instrumental sounds, as Rousseau implies, are equally signs of agency, vehicles of human intentionality, which is why the sound of a string or jazz quartet is not simply the acoustic trace of individual instrumentalists, but a signature of multiple agency of the people who made those sounds. As for the second point, it emerges from a study by Sinead O'Neill and John Sloboda of the interplay between performers and listeners in presentational situations, from which they conclude that while we tend to privilege playing music as the active part of the performer-audience relationship and to regard listening as the passive part, in fact the listener goes through many of the same mental processes as the performer. The nature of communal experience, such as a concert, is far more deeply shared than might be apparent from a simple specification of the diverse activities of the participants: playing, singing, listening, dancing. I'm not, of course, arguing that there is no difference between actual and virtual participation, just as Torino doesn't argue that presentational music is entirely without social effect. In one way, the difference is not so big as I've been making it, but in another way, it is so big, because if music's ability to engender experiences of bonding and empathy were limited to contexts of participation in Torino's sense, that is, shared interactive engagement in the actual doing of the activities with one another. Well, if that was the case, then there'd be little to distinguish making music together from team sports and other social activities in which people act out mutual dependence and shared goals. I'm suggesting that what is special about music is that the same kind of social and interpersonal benefits accrue when people participate as listeners and not just as performers. In other words, that they listen not passively, but as engaged members of a community. And the point, of course, is that in today's world, far more people participate in music as listeners than do as performers. And more than that, far more people participate through the mediation of recording technology than through so-called live music. That's what gives music its exceptional reach. If music's potential for social bonding and community formation was limited to the impossibly utopian communities that emerged from Smalls and Torino's books, then music would not be the emblematic practice of socialization and social transformation that it is. It is what it is, not because of its medievalizing or never-never land qualities, but because of the way that it works in the modern world.